let's look at solving quadratic equations by completing the square, which is an alternative method to factorizing or using the quadratic formula. So the question says, solve the following quadratic equations, with the first equation being x squared plus 2x minus 3 equals to 0. To solve this quadratic equation by completing the square, we first move over any constant terms to the other side of the equation. And so in this case, we would add 3 to both sides to give us x squared plus 2x, which equals to 3. What we now do is we complete the square on the left hand side. And so to complete the square here, we open up a bracket, we then write in the variable, which in this case is x. We half the coefficient of the single x term. So the coefficient here is 2. If we half that, we get 1. And so we add that on here, and then we square the bracket. Now, if we were to expand this bracket out, so x plus 1 times x plus 1, we would get the following. X times x, which equals to x squared, x times 1, which equals to x, 1 times x, which equals to x, and then 1 times 1, which equals to 1. And so collecting like terms, we would end up with x squared plus 2x plus 1. And so if we compare this with what we have originally on the left hand side, then we have x squared plus 2x. The extra term here is the 1. So if we were to write this as a squared bracket, we would then need to subtract the extra 1 here. So taking that away, we then equate this to 3. Now the next step is to add 1 to both sides, and so we have x plus 1 all squared, which equals to 3 plus 1, which is 4. Now the inverse of squaring is to square root both sides. Now if we look at this for a moment by considering the following, suppose we had x squared, which equals to 4, and we wanted to solve for x. Then square rooting both sides, we would end up with x equals to plus or minus 2. And the reason we get the plus or minus is because if we try this, so we put 2 back in and square this, we would end up with 4. And if we put minus 2 and we square all of that, we would also end up with 4. Both of these being solutions to this equation. Therefore, when we square root when solving an equation, we must add a plus or minus. So square rooting both sides, we now end up with x plus 1, which equals to plus or minus the square root of 4. And the square root of 4 is 2, so we can simplify this to x plus 1 equals to plus or minus 2, and so we end up with two solutions, the first being x equals to positive 2 minus 1, and the second being x equals to negative 2 minus 1. And so if we simplify these, we get x equals to 1 or x equals to minus 3. These are the two solutions to the first quadratic equation here. Second example is to solve x squared minus 3x minus 7 equals to 0 by completing the square. So again, we're going to move any constant terms to the other side of this equation. So in this case, we need to add 7 to both sides. So doing that, we're left with x squared minus 3x, which equals to 7. We're now going to complete the square on the left hand side here. So opening up a bracket, we write in the variable, which is x. We then look at the coefficient of the single x term, which in this case is minus 3, and then we half that. So halving that gives us minus 3 over 2. We then close the bracket and we add on a square. Now if we were to expand this bracket out, we would get the following. X times x gives us x squared. X times minus 3 over 2 gives us minus 3 over 2x, and then minus 3 over 2 times x gives us minus 3 over 2x again, and then minus 3 over 2 times minus 3 over 2 gives us plus 9 over 4. And if we collect like terms here, we end up with x squared minus, so minus 3 over 2 minus 3 over 2 is minus 6 over 2, which simplifies to minus 3. And we also have the x, so minus 3x and then plus 9 over 4. So comparing this with what we had originally, we see that we have an extra plus 9 over 4 here, and so we need to subtract that. And so we write in minus 9 over 4, and this equals to 7. Now adding 9 over 4 to both sides, we end up with x minus 3 over 2 all squared equals to 9 over 4 plus 7. You can now rewrite this as x minus 3 over 2 all squared, and then we have 9 over 4, and 7 can be written as 28 over 4. Now adding the two fractions on the right hand side, we're then left with x minus 3 over 2 all squared, and so 9 over 4 plus 28 over 4 gives us 37 over 4. We now square root both sides, and remembering that when we square root when solving an equation, we must add a plus or minus. So we now have x minus 3 over 2, which equals to plus or minus the square root of 37 over 4. And so using surd laws, we can split this surd in the following way. So we have x minus 3 over 2, which equals to plus or minus the square root of 37 over the square root of 4. And so we know that the square root of 4 is equal to 2, so we now get x minus 3 over 2, which equals to plus or minus the square root of 37 over 2. And so adding 3 over 2 to both sides, we then end up with two solutions. The first being plus root 37 over 2 plus 3 over 2, and we also end up with x equals minus root 37 over 2 plus 3 over 2. And so simplifying this into one single fraction, we end up with x equals root 37 plus 3 all over 2, and x equals minus root 37 plus 3 all over 2. So these are the two solutions to this quadratic equation. Final example is to solve 3x squared minus 5x plus 1 equals to 0 by completing the square. So again, we're going to move over any constant terms to the other side of the equation. And so we first write in 3x squared minus 5x, and now if we take away 1 from both sides, we get minus 1 on the right hand side of the equation. We now see that the coefficient of the squared term is not equal to 1. In this case, it's equal to 3, so we're going to divide through by the 3. If we do that, we end up with x squared for the first term, and then dividing minus 5x by 3 gives us minus 5 over 3 times x, and then on the right hand side we have minus 1 divided by 3, which is minus 1 over 3. We now complete the square as usual on the left hand side. So we write in a bracket, we take the variable, which in this case is x, we look at the coefficient of the single x term, which in this case is minus 5 over 3, and then we half that, which gives us minus 5 over 6. We then close the bracket and we square this. Now if we were to expand this bracket out, we would end up with the following. So x times x, which is x squared, x times minus 5 over 6, which is minus 5 over 6x, and the minus 5 over 6 times x, which is minus 5 over 6x, and the minus 5 over 6 times minus 5 over 6, which is plus 25 over 36. And so collecting like terms, we would end up with x squared, and now minus 5 over 6x minus 5 over 6x is minus 10 over 6x, which simplifies to minus 5 over 3x. And then we also have the fraction on the end here, which is 25 over 36. And so comparing this with x squared minus 5 over 3x, we see that we have an extra term on the end, which is 25 over 36. And so when we complete the square, we need to subtract that. And so we write in minus 25 over 36. And this equals to minus a third. Now the next step is to add 25 over 36 to both sides. So we now end up with x minus 5 over 6 all squared. And so on the right hand side, we now have 25 over 36 and then minus 1/3. We're now going to rewrite this in the following way. So we have x minus 5 over 6 all squared. And so we then have 25 over 36, and minus a third can be written as minus 12 over 36. Now taking away the two fractions from each other, we now end up with x minus 5 over 6 all squared. And now 25 over 36 minus 12 over 36 is 13 over 36. We're now going to square root both sides, and remembering that when we square root in an equation when solving, we must add a plus or minus. So we now end up with x minus 5 over 6, which equals to plus or minus the square root of 13 over 36. And so using our third laws, we can now write this as x minus 5 over 6, which equals to plus or minus the square root of 13 over the square root of 36. And now we know that the square root of 36 is equal to 6, so we can now write this as x minus 5 over 6, which equals to plus or minus the square root of 13 over 6. Now adding 5 over 6 to both sides gives us x equals plus or minus the square root of 13 over 6 plus 5 over 6. And so we can write this as two separate solutions by combining the fractions in the following way. So we get x equals positive root 13 plus 5 all over 6, or we get x equals negative root 13 plus 5 all over 6. And these are the two solutions to this quadratic equation by completing the square.